Hey, happy Wednesday to everybody. I hope you're having a great day. We just wanted to hop on real quick and look back to what we talked about this Sunday and look ahead to what we're going to talk about this coming Sunday and use it as if you weren't here this past Sunday, bring you up to speed and also an invitation for everybody to be here this Sunday as we finish up this sermon where we talk about the characteristics of a gospel-driven church and looking in the direction we're headed as a church to really just commit and a laser focus to gospel centrality within everything that we do and seeing how the gospel informs all that we do when it comes to our Sunday mornings, when it comes to our discipleship programs, our small groups, ministries, missions. That is the gospel that informs those things. And so we read 1 Corinthians 15. Verse 1, where Paul says, "Now I will remind you, brothers, of the gospel." Pause there for a moment. You know, Paul just spent 14 chapters. He wasn't writing in chapters, but he just spent what we read in 14 chapters talking to the church at Corinth about issues that they had and the way that their worship services look out. And when it comes about prophet and all these little just maybe disorderment that they have within the body, he spends 14 chapters talking about issues that they had or could have. And all of a sudden he just says, hey, I want to remind you of the gospel. I want to remind you of the gospel. And he says, in which you received, in which you stand, and by which you are being saved, if you hold fast to the word I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. And so Paul just all of a sudden abruptly says, hey, I want to remind you of the gospel. And that teaches us that, man, we need to be reminded of the gospel. We need to be reminded that the gospel is good news, that it is first and foremost, that it's a proclamation. It is an announcement of good news. And that we need to be reminded of the simple gospel that Jesus came and he died for our sins, that he was buried and that he was raised on the third day. We need to be reminded because the reality is we don't wake up in gospel mode every morning. Like how did you wake up this morning? Did you wake up feel like you were walking on water, like you were Moses and you had to take your shoes off because you're standing on holy ground? Or did you wake up this morning, you slept too late, you woke up in a hurry on your drive to work, everybody was in your way, everybody's going too fast or too slow? And the reality is that's how we wake up most of the mornings. And the tension is that everybody we come in contact with, that's how they woke up as well. We wake up thinking about it's my day and how is my day going, right? We think about those moments, and the reality is that we fail to forget that it's the Lord's day. And so we need to be reminded of the gospel, the good news that Jesus, he died, he was buried, and that he rose. And then we get caught up in what's going on in the world, and we begin to operate out of caution and fear. And sometimes we need to be reminded, hey, Jesus came and he died for our sins and he was buried and he rose again. So we talked about how we need to be reminded of the good news, the announcement that Jesus is victorious. And we talked about how a gospel-driven church is one that's always reprioritizing. He says in verse 3, I delivered to you as of first importance what I received. This first importance isn't in sequence, it is in central importance, that this is the most important thing. And the reason why we believe that is because look at the expansiveness of the gospel that he preached. You received it, you stand in it, and by which you're being saved. It extends through the Christian life. It isn't something that we move past. It's something that it's simple enough. Christ died for our sins. He was buried and he was raised. The child can believe that and be saved for all of eternity. But it's so complex that not only is it that, but by that same gospel, we're standing my stance before God as a finished thing that Jesus has done, that my standing before God isn't based on my performance. It's based on the fact that Jesus died, that he was buried, and that he rose again. And also that same message, that same gospel is what's transforming our lives. Now this coming Sunday, there's two more points that we're going to talk about. Here's the two I'm going to give to you. A gospel-driven church is constantly repenting. He says that he died for our sins. And the reality is when we think about being gospel-centered on Sunday mornings, and we have this mindset of this gospel, many times we're tempted to think of it so simple and it's so elementary. And this is what 1 Corinthians 15 teaches us, that when the gospel is preached, that the lost person can hear the message that saves them, But also, when the gospel is preached, the found person is hearing the message that can sanctify them. It says the gospel I preach is the one which you received and you stand and you're being saved. It is the gospel that does that. We talk about how we want our church, our place to be the safest place in the world for a sinner to be. We want it to be the most dangerous place for a sin to be. Now that's in the sin in the life of the unbeliever, but also sin in the life of the believer, that whenever the gospel is preached, sinners can find salvation. A lost woman can find salvation, but also the believer can find and hear what? The message of sanctification. And then the next thing we'll talk about this Sunday is that a gospel-driven church is constantly reforming. He says, if you hold fast to what I've preached to you, there's a tendency to move past. There's a tendency to move on. But a gospel-driven church is constantly reforming, making sure we're keeping the main thing. In Philippians chapter 3, and I'll end with this, Paul says, not that I have already obtained this, or am I already perfect, but I press on to make it my own, because Christ has made me his own. What Paul says is that I'm pressing to take hold of what has taken hold of me. Christ, through the gospel, has taken hold of us, and the rest of our life is taking a hold of what's already taken a hold of me, that we are constantly reforming, making sure that the gospel is where the gospel is supposed to be. So I hope to see you this week. Hey, I want to remind you, hey, Jesus came, he died for our sins, he was buried, and now he's risen. The tomb is empty. Be blessed.